showtime!
This is the fourth and final one of these, and you know the drill by now, I would hope. If not, go check the other ones out, but I'm here to ask one relatively simple question. How many C6s are actually broken? Enough to justify potentially costing more than a Scout PS5 or mid-range PC that you could be playing Genshin Impact on instead of that 10th generation iPhone or PS4 that both struggle to load into Mondstadt on a good day. But hey, at least you clear the Spiral Abyss a little bit faster than you did before. Unless that's C6 a child. As is tradition, we start off with a rather weak entry into the list, and that being Venti C6. Thanks to the fact that any resistance shred that you apply below 0% gets immediately cut in half, this doesn't really actually add that much damage unless you're going for the Animo. However, it's not a far stretch to say that if you have a C6 Venti, you might very well have a C4 Gene due to whaling. Not only that, but if you're trying to use C6 Venti to support a character like Xiao who doesn't particularly need Venti CC capabilities, that's really all he's bringing to the table, and you'll get more DPS out of something else instead. And while Wanderer aka Scaramouche may be on the horizon, I don't discuss leaks here, so moving on, this is a rather weak constellation. For being the immediate next character after Venti and not being an Archon, Klee actually had a surprisingly strong set of constellations. However, I think that kind of falls apart at C6. This is a rather weak bonus. Sure, it gives 10% pyro damage bonus, which is okay, but not really going to cut it for a C6. And the energy aspect of this, well, her teammates generally don't need energy, and it doesn't even provide energy for herself. It's just a really underwhelming constellation. For a C6, it's pretty damn bad. Most people who take any interest in constellations pretty much know the meme that is Child C6 by now. It is one of the unanimously most crapped on constellations, and you have to go through the C4 to get to it, which is infamous for lowering Child's DPS in some situations. That being said, this is one of those rare constellations that seems to prioritize overworld usage and fun, removing one of the most limiting aspects that most people view about Child's kit, which is the cooldown of his skill. Of course, when played around correctly, it's not a problem, but that is the issue. When you play Child correctly, his C6 brings little to no value to the table, basically just being a safety net for if you make a mistake. I would love to have this as a C1, but for a C6, it ain't gonna cut it. If you listen real closely, you can hear the 3,000 word hate essays being typed down in the comments below over what I'm about to say about Zhongli C6. These are things that I've said before in my worst constellation videos where I talked about this. Basically, everything Zhongli has in his kit, from his skill to his burst petrifying, from his constellation 2, 3, 4, and 5, they all work against his C6, making it overly redundant. Let's just go over the bullet points real quick. Zhongli has the strongest shield in the entire game, no questions asked. By default, it lasts 8 seconds longer than the very cooldown of the skill that applies it. C2 gives you yet another one of these attached to your burst that petrifies enemies, making them unable to attack you, on a 12-second cooldown no less. C3 adds 3 more levels to your shield, making it even stronger than it already is. C4 even adds 2 more seconds onto the petrification, bringing it up to 6 seconds at level 13, which is half of the cooldown of the very burst that applies it, which, not to mention, because of the C2, is giving you another shield. Yes, there are enemies that can pierce your shield like Rift Hounds, but sadly they make a very limited amount of appearances in the Spiral Abyss, and when they do, they are barely impactful. And we see other enemies that can pierce shields like Pyro Abyss Lectors even less often, and even when they do show up, you can just take their damage through your shield and ignore it. I do it many times with Ito and the 4 Geo Boys, and the next chamber I just don't take damage because of Zhongli's shield. It also makes him incompatible with one of his best teammates in the entire game, Hu Tao. I'm also going to clarify that I would love to have this constellation because I am one of those lazy people who lets my Zhongli shield drop all the time, especially in the overworld, and I take a ton of chip damage, and it would be nice to lazily heal that back without eating chickens or swapping in a healer for a moment. There's nothing wrong with liking or finding value in what is logically a bad constellation. I would love to have this one. I would also love to have C6 Child. It sounds fun. I would like to have C4 Yoimiya, which is also kind of a bad one. This has been my TED Talk on why Zhongli C6 is a steaming pile of shit. Thank you for listening. Moving on. After the last one, it's really nice to just have a simple one. Albedo's is just straight up mediocre. It's 17% damage with a rather annoying requirement for only the main field character. This is incredibly underwhelming for a C6. It's bad. We all know that Ganyu C6 is broken. This was without a doubt the first real broken C6 we got, and it still remains to be one of the strongest ones to this day. It's good in the overworld, it's good in Melt Ganyu, it's good in Freeze Ganyu, it's good in literally anything. And more importantly, it does give a real concrete purpose to her C2, which is otherwise a rather underwhelming one. Not much else to say about it. It's very good and it just makes Ganyu better at doing what she already wanted to do. Kind of like the opposite of Klee, who falls apart at C6, everything Xiao has culminates in his C6. He becomes a literal god of DPS. Now, it isn't without its limitations. Of course, you need 2 enemies, so anytime there's just one boss with a lot of HP, yeah, it's not useful. But when it works, oh, it does so much damage. It's not the easiest thing to play, and it opens up an entirely new playstyle for Xiao that has its nuances and things you need to learn. But once you master that, you have in your hands one of the strongest constellations in the entire game, if not the strongest, just with its caveats. Hu Tao's final constellation has a really bad reputation and honestly misconceptions about being only for speedrunners or showing off screenshots with big numbers in it. While yes, you can certainly use this constellation for that purpose, it does still have its uses without it. For one, you don't need to die to actually activate this. If you read it, it's just when falling below a certain health, which her skill will do eventually. Nor do you need to build all crit damage to get value out of this. If you just build her normally and get to something respectable like 50-60% crit rate, you're still gonna get a huge chunk of crit rate when this procs. Is it monstrously broken? No. Is it completely useless like some people like to say it is if you're not speedrunning? No, absolutely not. It's a pretty strong constellation. Eula's burst is famous for hitting like a truck that isekais anything it touches. Her C6, however, turns her burst into the truck that isekais the truck that isekais something else. If you couldn't follow that logic, her C6 makes big number bigger, and big number generally means good, even if big number is really overkill and nothing requires massively big number, but you get big number anyway. In terms of raw damage output, this constellation is just insanely strong. Not only does it make her burst a little bit safer by making its damage floor really high, but it also makes the ceiling ridiculously high. This is likely a constellation that a lot of Eula owners dream of having, and well, why wouldn't they? And it doesn't even have the drawback of Xiao's of being hard to use. It just blows everything up. Here's another one in the fun bucket. C6 Kazuha allows him to be used as an on-field pure Anemo DPS without having to require being infused by anyone else, not that we even have that option yet. If you continue to use Kazuha as Kazuha is normally used as a support that does his thing and gets off field, this isn't really going to do much for you. Obviously, if you're going to play him as a main DPS, yeah, it's going to do better, but that's not the way you normally play Kazuha. If you do, nothing wrong with that, but a lot of people are using him for his buffing capabilities, which this does very little for. So it's not broken, but it's a lot of fun, and I kind of want it. On paper, Ayaka C6 just looks really underwhelming. KQM's findings about its DPS increase really supports that, but honestly, I didn't expect it to be that low. In case you're not looking at the screen, they estimate it to be about a 4% DPS increase. As I said, on paper it looks rather underwhelming, and this really kind of supports that. I trust their math. I certainly don't have C6 Ayaka to prove them wrong, and well, I didn't really have high hopes for her to begin with. While a 50% chance to fire an extra arrow that does 60% of the original arrow's damage is a 30% damage increase on paper, thanks to ICD and wanting to vape certain hits, it doesn't equal out to actually being that much. Unless you're doing something like playing Mono Pyro, for example, that doesn't care when you do reactions. But since our best teams are often played with characters like Xingqiu and wanting to vape certain hits for maximum damage, this doesn't end up being as strong as it could be, but still is a rather strong constellation. Just for a C6, it doesn't give as much as you would expect one to. Raiden C6 is an extremely hard one to judge accurately because I believe it has potential to one day do crazy things in the right hands. The main issue is we already have rotations that take into account our current cooldowns and plan around them. So when you reduce the cooldown, oftentimes you don't actually end up doing anything meaningful. We see a similar issue with constellations like Ito C2 or Yoimiya C4, for example. They reduce their cooldown, but you can't actually really do anything with it because you need to take care of your supports. One day I think we could see a situation where this could be broken, but many of us don't have it to actually test it out, so it may take a while to be discovered. Kokomi's final con is yet another one that improves her personal damage, which while nice, and it's nice that she does better damage, it is rarely the reason why she's there. She often contributes her damage through either applying Hydro for other people to react off of, or being the Hydro that triggers reactions like in the case of Bloom, by stacking a bunch of EM on her, which in those cases a con like this just doesn't actually contribute much and certainly isn't worth the price it takes to get it. The crit damage alone on this constellation is already going to offer an insane amount of value, even if you lose every single 50-50 just like you do from the wishing system when you're swinging his club around. However, thanks to the sheer amount of stacks he can get from the rest of his kit and things like Ushi taking damage, there's bound to be some extra hits that you generate from this, even with some bad luck. But under the best of circumstances, this is going to be an absolute insane constellation that just tears everything apart in one single burst. His damage rotation is obviously going to become a little bit unpredictable thanks to this, However, you can probably predict that the enemy is going to die before you need to worry about it. Much like Shenhe herself, her C6 has a lot of potential with any future cryo characters we get. However, her C6 at present doesn't seem to do as much as you might think. Part of that is due to the fact that skills and bursts can still use up all the stacks and leave none to infinitely take advantage of with attacks and charge attacks. However, one of the main issues is that we don't have a character that can truly take this to its fullest potential, but I believe it does have extreme potential. The moment we get somebody like Yoimiya or Ayato or Child, but for cryo, this can really just take off, and I think that's honestly pretty likely. I think this C6 will realize its full potential a lot sooner than someone like Raiden's, for example. Now, many look at Raiden C2 and they're like, yeah, that's broken, and understandably so. And then they look at something like Yaemiko C6 and they're like, yes, this must also be broken, and yes, it is very strong. But it's not as strong as Raiden's because Raiden's burst is almost 100% of her damage, where Yaemiko's skill, on the other hand, it is a lot of her damage, but it isn't 100% thanks to her burst hitting like an absolute truck as well. That being said, defense ignore, still an incredibly powerful thing, and this is just very strong. Ayato got one extremely similar to his sister Ayaka, and, well, while not as underwhelming, it is certainly not extremely strong. It's by no means a bad or worthless constellation, but when you factor in the fact that it's a C6, I don't think it quite lives up to what the expectations for one should be, neither in fun or the power that it provides. On paper, Yelan's 6th constellation may look a little bit underwhelming compared to what it sounds like, and the reasoning for that is because it's causing you to use extra field time for Yelan herself, and you're taking that away from a character who would otherwise be using it. However, here's the deal. She does so much burst damage with the C6 that most things won't even live long enough to require DPSing with somebody else. In short bursty fights, this is going to end it almost immediately with the insane amount of burst damage that she provides. There's also the fact that while she's firing these off, she's also triggering her own burst, adding even more single target onto it. Personally, I think this is one of the strongest ones in the entire game, adding onto her already crazy list of constellations. It just has the caveat of being not so great in really long sustained fights, which unfortunately we don't have many of right now. Tignari's 6th constellation is a rather interesting one. It has use not only in his normal playstyle, being used as more quick swap to do his thing and get off onto other characters, or just to actually stay on field with them and fire charge arrows as if you were Ganyu. The extra cluster bloom arrow that this fires has no ICD, so every time you shoot it, it will trigger spread as well as do pretty respectable damage on its own. Not only that, but the decreased charge time will actually shave time off his normal rotations. It's just a matter of how you take advantage of that time and how well you can actually take advantage of the reduced charge time and fire off his arrows quicker. In the best of scenarios, it ends up being a pretty strong constellation, and in scenarios where you want to use him more as a charge shotter, well, it helps that out too, making it just a pretty good constellation overall. Finding exact numbers on Cyno's C6 isn't exactly the easiest thing to do right now. However, you can look at the raw motion values that this can provide, and when you do that, it looks pretty good. Not to mention more hits equals more reactions, which are aggravate really freaking strong. Just the raw motion values of these bolts alone can add up to over 1500% damage, which is a lot of extra damage to be adding on, not to mention any individual reactions they may be proccing. I literally have no data to back this up other than that you can trigger about 12 to 16 of these things in a single burst, and with that it sounds pretty strong, but I could be wrong either way. Admittedly, I once thought Nilou's C6 looked like the most broken thing I'd ever seen. That was before actually trying her for myself and seeing what kind of damage numbers she could personally do. Now, they're not completely laughable numbers, they are decent enough. However, they're just not why I bring Nilou into my teams. I want her there to either be triggering reactions, hopefully get her some EM and some HP on her. Her personal damage just ends up being more of a bonus to me, similar to units like Kazuha or Kokomi. But I can say this about the C6, the raw value here and the requirement to get it is so good. You already want to stack HP on her, so that's no problem at all. And 30% crit rate and 60% crit damage, that is huge. I'm really not entirely sure gut reaction is to say this is good, but probably not broken. Just like I thought, just like Zhongli, this gacha splash does not work with this transition. So obviously Nahida is still super new and she is not fully solved yet. However, you can look at this constellation and much like Cyno, you can see that the damage numbers are pretty good. However, there's a big difference. Cyno is a main DPS who should be building a lot of crit stats and attack and has good stuff to scale off of. Nahida, however, a little bit different, wanting to build EM, and while this does have EM scaling, her crit rate is usually going to suffer by using an EM hat, and she's obviously not usually building a Dendro Cup. The damage that this offers is a little bit under what a level 12 or 13 Nahida skill would offer, so it essentially almost doubles her skill's damage, so so how good this is depends on how much damage your skill is currently doing, I suppose. Obviously an AoE that'll generate a pretty good amount of damage, and single target, yeah, it'll probably just be okay. I feel like this is probably just somewhere near the middle. Not broken, but not underpowered. Certainly not overpowered, you know, like my patrons are. My patrons are very overpowered. Once you subscribe to my Patreon, which is cheaper than a C6, by the way, you can plug in USBs on the first try. One side of your pillow will always be cold. Spoons will never fall into pots that you're cooking with on top of the stove. None of your left socks will ever go missing, ever again. You won't have to deal with that problem anymore where you'd have to sneeze